we propose to discuss a little bit the use of authentic materials in our class. This is the main topic of our workshop today. I would like to start talking about authentic materials to develop communicative competence, okay? So usually we have this very broad goal, most of us for our courses, at least for courses that don't have specific purposes. Our main goal is that learners can communicate effectively in the target language of a particular speech community, right? And then we have this broad goal and we start looking for a textbook that will allow us to help our students to be good communicators. But then when we go to the textbook and we start seeing what the researchers have found when they analyze the textbook language, what we see is that the language in the textbook does not represent native and advanced speakers' practices in conversation. It does not provide good models for our learners to communicate effectively, and it usually is manipulated in such a way that the textbook can make students focus mainly on vocabulary and grammar at the expense of communication. And it's very hard, if not impossible, to find a textbook that does not ignore casual conversation. So how can we use these textbooks to develop communicative competence if this is the reality that we usually find in the textbooks that are available for us? So just to give you an example of many researchers that have been done in comparing natural language use with textbook language, we have this one study that compared 3 different types of invitation in natural conversations and in the examples of a particular textbook, Say It Naturally, which is an English textbook that is considered a very good one in terms of resembling natural conversations. So what this researcher found is that when we look at these 3 types of invitations, one of them being an ambiguous invitation, which is the direct kind of invitation when we invite and say of a particular place and time to meet. The second type is a more ambiguous type of invitation in which there is a kind of negotiation in between the 2 speakers and the invitation is not made directly. And we have a third type, which is the non-negotiable non-invitation, which is something like, we must get together sometime, something like that. So when we compare the percentage of these 3 types of invitation in natural conversations, we find a very different picture of what we can find in the textbook. So these students are learning almost only an ambiguous type of invitation, and they cannot know when to use each of them. And if we think about the reality of a second language learner who is usually meeting people for the first time in the second language community, probably the invitation that would be more useful for the second language learner would be the ambiguous invitation, in which there is a little bit of negotiation with somebody that I don't know very well, right? So we are not teaching a specific ability, a communication skill that would be very useful for the second language learner. And it can cause all sorts of problems when this learner goes out there and starts to interact with the target language community. Then, well, we could say, let's forget about the textbook then, and let's switch to the authentic materials, right? But what does research tell us about comparing when we use textbooks to teach and when we use authentic materials? What are the results that we have, right? So I'm going to, from many different research, again, I'm going to talk about one specific research. So in this particular study, they compared the use of textbook and authentic materials to develop Japanese learners' communicative competence in English. So they use 8 different tests to see how much these learners learned in terms of communicative competence after being taught with the textbook and with authentic materials. And what they find is that the group that received instruction with authentic materials outperformed the other group in 5 of the 8 tasks. So they conclude, or they say that this indicates that authentic materials were more effective at developing communicative competence. I'm not trying to say that we have to abandon our textbook and just switch to the to authentic materials, but this is something that we need to take into consideration when we prepare our classes. Take into consideration what research is telling us about the ways in which the students learn more effectively, right? So then we can say, well, let's incorporate authentic materials into our classes, right? But the first thing that we need to do is, what are the authentic materials? How do I define authenticity? How do I distinguish in between an authentic material and a non-authentic material? So I brought you definitions from different experts. We need, of course, to find our own definition, but these are some of them for us to take into consideration. So one of them is the authentic language is the one produced by native and advanced speakers for native and advanced speakers and not for pedagogical purposes. It's an unedited and unsimplified type of language. It's not limited to written form, so it also includes spoken language. And it's related to cultural and the ability to behave or think like a member of the target language group. So these are some of the definitions. This is not comprehensive. There's not everything here, but this is what I found useful for us to think about when we decide to use authentic materials in our classroom. But this is still not enough, because we still have to decide what is the good authentic language for the language classroom. Because if we think about, for instance, a mother interacting with her 2-year-old when this 2-year-old start learning the language, maybe that's not the best authentic material to bring to the classroom, depending on what we want to do. So we still need to find authentic language for classroom learning, for language learning. So the 2 things that I found that are most interesting when we decide what kind of authentic material is good for us is, one, the text, the authentic text that enable the learner to interpret meaning that then can be shared with native and advanced speakers of the language. So interpretation of meaning is very important. And the second aspect is the text that help the learner to discover conventions of communication in the target language. So the learner can find patterns that can be transferable to other kinds of situations, okay? So then let's say we have decided that we are going to incorporate authentic materials in our classroom. And this is something that we did here at CLIC. But there is another step that we need to follow. We need to see how we are going to use this authentic materials, what we need to teach to our students, right? So we decided to kind of assess a little bit what they needed. So 2 years ago, we started sending our students out to talk to native and advanced speakers of the language and record themselves and bring these videos back to the classroom so we could give them feedback about how they were communicating with these advanced and native speakers. And also we could assess what was lacking in their ability to communicate, what we needed to teach them, right? So I'm going to show you an excerpt of three segments of French students. These are students who are at the beginning of the 3rd semester interacting with their tutors, which are either native speakers of French or advanced speakers of French. And I want you to try to tell me what's wrong with these conversations. When you look at these conversations, what do you think that's not really working there? What needs to be fixed?
Oh, si. Elle m'a dit qu'il y avait une vidéo vraiment cool dans la conférence. C'est quoi cette vidéo?
C'est super.
Ils ont fait quoi dans la vidéo? Qu'est-ce qu'ils ont fait? C'est quoi la vidéo? Parce que je ne l'ai pas vu moi. Mais j'ai juste entendu que c'était cool. Il y avait quoi sur la vidéo? Est-ce que tu peux me dire un peu qu'est-ce qu'il y avait sur la vidéo? Par exemple, je sais pas.
Qu'est-ce que tu fais
dans la vidéo?
Dans la scène.
Ah!
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Je m'appelle Cécile.
Je m'appelle Nicolas. Et je m'appelle.
Enchantée. Donc vous êtes dans la même classe en fait?
Oui.
D'accord. Super. Vous êtes en quelle année? C'est votre première année? Deuxième année?
Ah oui, première année.
Première année, d'accord. Bon, moi aussi c'est ma première année, mais pour le master.
Et tu viens d'où en fait? Tu viens de quelle ville? De quelle ville viens-tu? De quelle ville? Ville? Oui. Ou État? Non. D'où est-ce que tu viens? Je suis de Tennessee.
Okay, so any ideas? What's not really working there? Yes?
Okay, they didn't seem to understand like a basic question, like where are you from?
Mm-hmm.
This is probably going to be asked very quickly in a conversation.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Yeah, they don't understand basic language. What else? Yes?
Yeah, it seems to be like the questions are not formulated in a way that the student could understand, first of all.
So probably the student is lacking this communication ability to understand how people speak when they talk.
That's correct.
Uh-huh.
And from the teacher or tutor side as well, looking for an easier way to formulate the question would ease, the student's understanding and answers, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah, maybe colloquialism as well. The first one is saying that it was very cool, and maybe they were not ready to answer that. They didn't even know what it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you were pointing out to lack of comprehension, right? So one thing that we noticed in our students is that they didn't know what to do when they didn't understand. They would just freeze, and the dialogue would, and the tutor would be the one who had to find a way to keep the communication going. So all the burden of moving the dialogue forward, moving the conversation forward was on the tutor. The students did not take their role as I need to be an active participant, I need to participate as much as my tutor in this conversation. This conversation is as much my responsibility as any other speaker here, right? So this is what we started try to teach them, how to be active participants in the conversation, how to make sure that they ask questions when they don't understand, when they need help, how to ask about the other person, because they were only responding to questions it looked more like an interview than like a conversation, because they never asked any question. They were just waiting for the tutor to ask them questions. So what could we do to help them be more active in these conversations? So we decided to do some of these things. These are the main ones. There are others that we could talk about. The first one is to develop a curriculum that is informed by empirical research. So we started reading and trying to find out what research says about how to teach these things to students, right? We started incorporating recordings of natural conversations, as well as other authentic, semi-authentic materials in our classroom. We started raising the learners' awareness about patterns that they could find in communication, so to target specifically communicative competence in the classroom, to help learners analyze their own conversation as well as the target language conversations, okay? So they became like analysts, researchers kind of themselves when they started analyzing what they were doing with this native and advanced speakers and what the native speakers were doing when they were talking among them. And also we kept doing, as you saw, send out the students to talk to native and advanced speakers and bring these recordings back to the classroom where we could give them feedback and help them improve throughout the semester. So today we are going to focus more on the second one, right? How to use authentic material in the classroom. And I know one thing that happens when we talk about authentic material is that we tend to think about it's going to be really hard to incorporate this. It's so complicated to work with authentic material in the classroom, so let's just avoid that and go with my textbook because it's going to be so much easier. And it's true, it's so much easier to just follow the textbook, right? So what I would like to share with you is what we try to do to avoid some of the problems or some of the difficulties, the obstacles that come with incorporating authentic material in our classrooms. The first obstacle is related to the degree of difficulty of the authentic material, right? So usually we think about authentic material for third-year students. We never think about using authentic material with first-year students because it's too difficult. Well, here at the center, we've been trying to use authentic material since the first semester. So what we do is we need a careful selection of texts and a careful design of activities to make this accessible to learners of all levels. So it's going to require us to think about the students in the first year in order to be able to use authentic material. If we design the activities in a way that they can follow what we are asking them to do, we should be good. Also, we kind of approach the authentic material step by step. So usually we initiate the approach to the authentic material with comprehension questions about. So we help them understand the meaning behind what they are listening or what they are reading. And then we move to, we shift their attention to form, to conversation patterns. But we first need them to understand what is behind that piece that they have in front of them. The second thing is that, well, usually students are not ready to understand everything in the authentic material because there will be a lot of things that they haven't learned yet. So there will be always the issue of partial comprehension. So instead of seeing partial comprehension as a negative thing, what we try to see is partial comprehension of authentic material is a way to encourage them to face their own reality. The second language learner is not going to understand everything in the foreign language. This is a reality that we need to face when we learn a second language. And it's okay. Even native speakers of the language sometimes don't understand 100% of what's being said or what they read. So try to be comfortable with partial comprehension is something that can actually help them learn and be comfortable with going out and interacting with native speakers or advanced speakers. The pace of spoken language. So the speed in which native and advanced speakers usually interact it makes it very hard for lower level students. So many times what we do in the first year is we combine the audio with transcriptions. So many times what they do is they work on the transcription first, so they get used to the content, and then they move to the audio, which is what we don't usually do that in that order. But for the first year, that's an order that usually works. When they listen to the audio, they already know what to expect. They have already read it. They are more comfortable with it. It's an extremely time-consuming process. Yes, that's definitely. So we all know that looking for these materials and designing activities with authentic language data is very time-consuming. So this doesn't solve the problem completely, but one thing that we've been trying to do here at the center is to share ideas and collaborate with colleagues. And this helps because if I design an activity that somebody else, some of my colleagues can use, that's saving their time. And then they will share their activity with me, and this is saving everybody's time. So collaboration is a key process. Yes?
When you said to combine the recordings with the transcript, would you recommend that the teacher models that and speaks it very slowly first and then speaks it a little bit quicker and then expose the students to the real pace of authentic language?
I don't know if that would work. What we usually do is that the students work on the transcription. So let's say we transcribe the audio. We bring the transcription first. They have to do like a fill in the blank with the transcription, or they have to do some vocabulary work. So they work on the transcription. And then we can just move them away from the transcription, say, let's close your handout, and now let's go to the audio and listen to it. So because they have read the transcription before,
it's easier for them. But how many times would a teacher repeat that authentic material? Like 2 or 3 times? More?
it will depend a lot on your students, but what we usually do is we don't repeat until they get everything. Just because they need to be comfortable, we need to focus on the exercise and activities that we are doing at that specific time, on the forms that we are learning at that specific time, or at the vocabulary that we are learning. We don't need to understand every single word of the audio, because when we are listening to a native speaker, that's what's going to happen. We are not going to understand everything if we are a learner. And that's fine. That's okay. We can ask. We can try to guess a little bit from the context. There are different things that we can do at that point.
And would you use the authentic material just for comprehension, or would you ask the students also to produce spoken language according to the...
Oh, they are asked to produce, yes. So the authentic materials is used to design activities for them to learn, analyze, learn, grammar, vocabulary, communication patterns, and then it can be used also for a practice activity. Okay, we can use for both. So to end my presentation, I just would like to show you a little bit what happened 2 years later. This is a conversation between two learners, one at the right and the one at the left, with a native speaker of Spanish in the middle. And this is the result, a little bit of the result of what all the changes that we've made. I have to tell you that the student on the right, was my strongest student, my best student that semester. But the student at the left was my weakest student in that class. Okay, so you are going to see that he really struggles. But what I want you to pay attention to is how they communicate, how the conversation moves, and how he handles the linguistic flaws or problems that he has.
Hola, hola, ¿cómo están?
Bien, ¿y tú?
Bien. ¿Bien cansada? Pero bien.
Sí, tengo mucho trabajo ahora.
Yo también.
Brown tiene su fiesta pública este fin de semana y yo estoy un head caregiver. No, ¿cómo se dice head caregiver?
Tiene que ser la persona encargada de asegurar que todo el mundo esté bien.
Sí, así tengo mucho trabajo.
Brown Public es Bacchanalia.
Sí, Bacchanalia. Es una fiesta muy grande.
Yo me he visto el toga.
Sí, toga. Te tienes que poner la toga.
Fue al Bacchanalia
el año pasado, sí, y lo pasé súper bien. Es una fiesta buena.
¿Qué hiciste este fin de semana?
Tristemente, estuve estudiando todo el fin de semana.
Sí.
Estas últimas 2 semanas, todo, nunca hay un momento de descanso.
Muy rápido.
Pero
¿Estudias para qué?
tengo un examen de inmunología el viernes y una presentación de sociología el jueves.
Sociología 101 con Dr. Word.
Sí. Me gusta mucho la clase, pero es mucho trabajo también.
Sí.
Yo no me lo esperaba.
Sí, yo...
There's more, but I'll stop there because we have other things to do. So can you feel the difference in how they interact? So these are students who are at the end of the 2nd semester of Spanish. And they can already hold a conversation with a native speaker. So I think it's worth all the work that we have when we incorporate authentic materials. It has an effect. So that's it. That's my presentation for today.